This story begins with a statement that traveled faster than intention. An Australian traveler, confident and dismissive, laughed publicly at Intramuros in Manila, calling it overrated, outdated, and unworthy of attention. His comment spread quickly, echoed by others who had never stepped inside its walls. To him, history looked like decay. Old stone meant irrelevance. What he did not realize was that his words exposed a deeper blindness, one shaped by modern expectations and shallow encounters. This documentary follows what happened next, not as punishment or redemption, but as confrontation. Because what awaited him inside Intramuros was not nostalgia or tourism. It was a layered truth that resisted quick judgment. And once encountered honestly, it left him shaken, silent, and unwilling to repeat the joke that started everything. Before arriving in Manila, the Australian had built his confidence on comparison. He measured cities against one another, ranking them by convenience, polish, and global recognition. Anything unfamiliar felt inferior. Intramuros, in his mind, was a relic clinging to relevance. His mockery was casual, not cruel, shaped by ignorance rather than intent. Yet influence does not require malice to cause harm. His dismissal aligned with a familiar narrative, that history outside Western preservation standards lacked value. The narration emphasizes how easily such assumptions settle into certainty. They require no investigation, only repetition. This was the mindset he carried when he entered Manila, unaware that the walls he dismissed had endured centuries of conflict, survival, and reinvention that no modern skyline could fully capture. Intramuros was never designed to impress outsiders quickly. Its meaning reveals itself slowly, layered through memory rather than spectacle. The documentary shifts focus here, emphasizing that places like Intramuros are not monuments frozen in time, but living records shaped by conquest, resilience, and cultural negotiation. To reduce it to ruins is to misunderstand its function. The Australian's early commentary ignored this entirely. He saw weathered stone and assumed failure. He mistook preservation for stagnation. What he could not yet see was that Intramuros was not asking to be admired. It was asking to be understood. That distinction would matter later. At this point in the story, however, he remained convinced that the site was little more than a romanticized shell, celebrated out of obligation rather than substance. Public response to his comment unfolded unevenly. Some laughed along. Others responded calmly, offering context rather than confrontation. Historians, locals, and cultural advocates explained what Intramuros represented, not as a tourist attraction, but as a witness to colonial violence, resistance, and survival. Their tone was measured. They did not demand apology. They invited engagement. This restraint unsettled him. He expected outrage, not explanation. The narration highlights how defensiveness thrives on conflict, but weakens under patience. The conversation refused to escalate. Instead, it lingered. Articles appeared. Videos circulated. Invitations emerged. Eventually, curiosity replaced certainty. The Australian agreed to walk through Intramuros properly, not as a critic or influencer, but as a listener. He expected confirmation of his beliefs. What followed dismantled them quietly. Why? At first, nothing dramatic occurred. Intramuros did not reveal itself instantly. The narration stresses that meaningful places rarely do. He noticed the absence of spectacle, the lack of curated drama. This disappointed him initially. But as time passed, patterns emerged. Stories overlapped. Histories contradicted convenience. The walls were not decorative, they were defensive. The streets were not quaint, they were strategic. Every structure carried consequence. The Australian began to realize that his expectations were misplaced. He had come looking for entertainment, not meaning. Intramuros offered none of the former and all of the latter. This mismatch unsettled him. He found himself slowing down, asking questions he had not planned to ask. The mockery that once felt effortless now felt premature. The deeper he went, the more the narrative resisted simplification. Intramuros was not a symbol of glory alone, nor of victimhood alone. It was contradiction embodied. Faith and force coexisted. Beauty and brutality shared the same ground. The documentary emphasizes how this complexity challenges visitors accustomed to sanitized history. The Australian struggled with this discomfort. He realized that his earlier dismissal was not just about architecture. It was about control. Intramuros could not be consumed quickly. It demanded attention without reward. The longer he listened, the more his confidence eroded. He recognized how often he equated decay with failure, forgetting that survival itself was evidence of strength. By this point, his silence was no longer performative. It was necessary. What unsettled him most was not what he learned, but what he felt. Intramuros carried emotional weight that no guidebook prepared him for. Loss, resilience, adaptation. These themes emerged without announcement. The Australian began to understand that beauty was not hidden behind restoration or polish. It lived in endurance. The documentary narration highlights this shift as pivotal. He stopped comparing Intramuros to other historic cities and started encountering it on its own terms. The change was subtle but irreversible. He realized that his mockery had been rooted in distance, not understanding. Once distance collapsed, judgment followed. Intramuros did not contradict his expectations aggressively. It simply ignored them. And in doing so, it exposed how shallow those expectations had been. Silence emerged as a recurring theme. Not absence, but presence without assertion. Intramuros did not announce itself. It allowed itself to be encountered. The Australian learned to value that posture. He stopped expecting places to perform. He met them with openness. This shift extended beyond heritage sites. It reshaped his interactions broadly. Listening replaced judgment. Observation replaced assumption. Intramuros had taught him that meaning often reveals itself only when certainty retreats. That retreat felt unfamiliar at first. Eventually, it felt necessary. The documentary underscores that such shifts rarely feel dramatic. They feel subtle, cumulative, and enduring. The broader audience absorbed the lesson differently. Some reflected. Some moved on. The documentary does not measure success through consensus. It measures it through possibility. Intramuros opened a door. Some walked through. Others did not. That outcome was acceptable. Heritage does not exist to persuade everyone. It exists to remain available. Intramuros remained. The Australian changed. That asymmetry mattered. It demonstrated that transformation belonged to the visitor, not the site. Responsibility followed attention. The story resisted closure because closure implied completion. Growth rarely completes. It continues. The memory of the initial mockery no longer defined the narrative. It served as a reference point, a reminder of how quickly dismissal can precede understanding. Intramuros did not punish that dismissal. It waited. The documentary highlights this patience as instructive. Endurance does not argue. It persists. The Australian learned that lesson slowly. He stopped equating reaction with relevance. He understood that some places existed beyond commentary. That understanding grounded him. It reduced urgency. It encouraged humility. Intramuros remained unchanged. The visitor adjusted. The story expanded beyond one site. It reflected how many histories are flattened by casual judgment. Intramuros stood for all such places. The Australian's experience illustrated how quickly distance breeds dismissal. Closing that distance required effort. The documentary invites viewers to consider their own patterns. How often is mockery easier than engagement? How frequently is certainty more comfortable than curiosity? Intramuros challenged those instincts. It demanded patience. That demand proved transformative. Not because it persuaded, but because it endured. The Australian's growth mirrored what was possible for anyone willing to slow down and least. Being shocked by beauty, he later realized, was not about aesthetics. It was about recognition. Intramuros forced him to recognize histories he had overlooked. That recognition unsettled him. It reoriented his perspective. He stopped approaching unfamiliar places as evaluations. He approached them as conversations. That shift mattered. Conversations require listening. Intramuros spoke quietly. He learned to hear it. The documentary emphasizes that such moments rarely feel triumphant. They feel grounding. They replace confidence with awareness. That replacement was the real shock. Beauty, in this context, was not visual. It was ethic. The story clarifies that it is fictional, yet grounded in truth. It reflects patterns repeated across cultures and histories. Intramuros symbolizes resilience rather than exception. The Australian symbolizes influence without awareness. Their encounter represents possibility. Change does not require spectacle. It requires attention. The documentary invites viewers to examine how they encounter unfamiliar heritage. With judgment or curiosity. With speed or patience. Intramuros remains, offering the same invitation it always has. Whether it is accepted depends entirely on the visitor. That responsibility cannot be outsour. The story ends without finality. Intramuros stands. The visitor moves on. What remains is the lesson. Mockery reveals ignorance. Attention reveals meaning. Beauty does not announce itself. It waits. Intramuros waited. When the Australian finally listened, the experience unsettled him permanently. That discomfort proved valuable. It replaced certainty with humility and dismissal with respect. The documentary leaves viewers with a simple truth. Heritage does not exist to impress. It exists to remember. And when encountered honestly, it has the power to change those willing to remain long enough to be corrected. The memory of his mockery remained with him, not as shame, but as instruction. It reminded him how easily confidence can precede knowledge. Intramuros exposed that pattern gently but firmly. He stopped assuming that familiarity equaled relevance. He understood now that distance often disguises value. This realization extended beyond travel. It reshaped how he approached conversations, art, and history. The site became a quiet teacher. It did not demand acknowledgement. It allowed it. The documentary highlights this dynamic as rare in an era obsessed with reaction. Intramuros waited. He arrived late. That lateness mattered. It underscored that growth often begins after missteps, not before them. The story does not end with consensus. Some viewers remained unconvinced. Others felt validated. The documentary avoids resolution. Instead, it focuses on trajectory. Intramuros continued its existence independent of discourse. That independence mattered. It affirmed that heritage does not exist to persuade. It exists to remember. The Australian carried that understanding forward. He stopped expecting places to explain themselves to him. He learned to meet them with humility. Intramuros did not demand admiration. It demanded respect. That distinction reshaped his expectations permanently. The site did not shock him with beauty in the conventional sense. It confronted him with meaning. That confrontation proved far more enduring than any aesthetic revelation. Looking back, he recognized that his shock came not from discovery, but from correction. Intramuros corrected his assumptions without argument. It allowed him to confront his limitations privately. That privacy mattered. Growth rarely thrives under spectacle. The documentary emphasizes this quiet transformation. It rejects viral redemption arcs. Instead, it presents change as ongoing, incomplete, and internal. Intramuros did not transform him into an authority on history. It reminded him of his responsibility as a visitor, to observe before judging, to ask before dismissing, to listen before speaking. These lessons extended beyond Manila. They followed him into every unfamiliar space thereafter. The broader implication of the story reaches beyond one individual. Intramuros symbolizes how easily heritage is misread when stripped of context. The documentary invites viewers to examine their own assumptions. How often do opinions precede engagement? How frequently does mockery replace curiosity? The Australian's experience becomes a mirror rather than a spectacle. It reflects a pattern many recognize but rarely confront. Intramuros did not request empathy. It demanded awareness. That demand reshaped the narrative around it. Visitors arrived differently. Conversations deepened. The site remained patient. It had always been. The only thing that changed was attention. That shift, though subtle, proved powerful. Time reinforced the lesson. The Australian no longer sought validation through commentary. He chose engagement over reaction. He acknowledged when he lacked understanding. This restraint earned quiet respect. He realized that influence did not require constant assertion. Sometimes it required withdrawal. Intramuros had taught him that stepping back could be an act of respect. The site did not need intermediaries. It spoke through presence. That presence endured. He understood that his role was temporary. History was not. This perspective grounded him. It reduced urgency. It encouraged patience. Intramuros did not demand to be defended. It existed as evidence. The documentary emphasizes that beauty, in this context, was not ornamental. It was structural. It lived in survival, continuity, and memory. Intramuros had endured colonization, war, neglect, and misinterpretation. Its continued existence was not accidental. It reflected intention. That realization reframed the Australians' understanding of value. Preservation was not about aesthetics alone. It was about acknowledgement. Intramuros preserved narratives often excluded from dominant histories. That preservation carried weight. The site did not flatter visitors. It challenged them. The Australian accepted that challenge belatedly. The delay mattered. It underscored how often understanding arrives only after resistance dissolves. The story gained relevance beyond travel discourse. It entered conversations about cultural respect, historical accountability, and listening. Intramuros became a case study without being reduced to one. The Australians' experience illustrated how quickly dismissal can spread and how slowly understanding follows. The documentary does not position this imbalance as inevitable. It presents it as correctable. Attention, when applied intentionally, can reverse harm. Intramuros did not require rebranding. It required patience. That patience reshaped engagement. The Australian carried this lesson into his work and conversations. He stopped framing unfamiliarity as deficiency. He recognized it as invita. As time passed, the incident lost urgency but retained meaning. It was no longer about mockery. It was about response. The Australian did not claim transformation. He demonstrated it through consistency. Intramuros remained unchanged. That constancy mattered. It proved that heritage did not depend on affirmation. It existed regardless of opinion. The documentary emphasizes this independence as strength. Intramuros did not seek to be liked. It sought to endure. That endurance challenged visitors to match its patience. Few did initially. More did over time. The shift was gradual but real. The narrative returns repeatedly to one idea. Attention alters perception. Intramuros had always been complex. What changed was willingness to engage with that complexity. The Australian's journey illustrates how easily complexity is dismissed when speed is prioritized. Slowing down revealed layers he had not expected. Those layers unsettled him. That discomfort proved necessary. The documentary reframes discomfort as productive rather than negative. Intramuros demanded it. In exchange, it offered understanding. That exchange was fair. It required effort proportional to reward. The Australian accepted that balance eventually. His earlier mockery faded in relevance. The lesson remained. By the time he acknowledged his error publicly, the tone had changed. He did not frame his experience as discovery or revelation. He spoke about humility. He admitted that his expectations had limited his perception. Reactions were mixed. Some welcomed the acknowledgement. Others questioned its timing. The documentary avoids framing this as redemption. What mattered was consequence. Conversations shifted. Viewers who had dismissed Intramuros reconsidered. Interest increased. Context replaced caricature. The Australian did not position himself as a spokesperson. He stepped back. The site did not need validation from him. That realization marked his greatest shift. He learned that respect was not expressed through praise, but through restraint, knowing when to speak and when to allow history to stand without commentary. Intramuros continued existing as it always had, patient, layered, uninterested in trends. The documentary emphasizes that its value was never dependent on external approval. What changed was attention. More people arrived willing to listen. More conversations unfolded with nuance. The Australian observed this from a distance. He understood now that his role was not central. His experience was one of many. That humility mattered. He recognized that his initial mockery had not diminished Intramuros. It had revealed his own limitations. This awareness reshaped how he approached unfamiliar places afterward. He no longer led with comparison. He led with curiosity. The site had taught him that some forms of beauty resist immediacy. They require patience, discomfort, and surrender of control. The narration widens the lens here, examining how heritage sites are often misunderstood by visitors seeking affirmation rather than understanding. Intramuros challenges that impulse. It does not flatter. It confronts. The Australian's experience became an example of how modern travel often prioritizes consumption over comprehension. He had arrived expecting to be impressed. He left aware that impression was never the point. Intramuros existed to remember, not to entertain. That realization lingered. It reshaped his relationship with history, culture, and criticism. He became cautious with dismissal, aware of how easily influence could flatten complexity. The site did not change. He did. And that distinction remained central to the story that continued long after he left its walls. Months later, the Australian reflected on how quickly certainty had collapsed once he slowed down. He realized that mockery often functions as defense, protecting the speaker from vulnerability. Intramuros required vulnerability. It demanded acknowledgement of histories that did not resolve neatly. The documentary highlights how such places unsettle visitors accustomed to clean narratives. He began recognizing similar patterns elsewhere. Whenever discomfort appeared, curiosity followed. Intramuros became a reference point, not as an attraction but as a lesson. He stopped rating places. He started listening to them. This shift did not make him an expert. It made him attentive. The story emphasizes that attentiveness, not expertise, is the foundation of respect when encountering cultures shaped by histories different from one's own. Criticism of his earlier comment never disappeared completely. Some believed apology was insufficient. Others believed growth was enough. The documentary does not resolve this tension. Instead, it focuses on continuity. Change proved itself through behavior, not statements. He adjusted how he spoke publicly. He avoided quick judgments. He acknowledged when he lacked context. These shifts were quiet. They did not trend. Yet they mattered. Intramuros had taught him that endurance outlasts attention. The site did not respond to mockery because it did not need to. It had survived far worse. That realization humbled him. He understood that respect was not owed to him by history. He owed it to history through restraint, patience, and willingness to be unsettled. Ed. The documentary emphasizes that Intramuros represents countless heritage sites misunderstood through superficial lenses. Modern audiences often demand instant gratification. Intramuros offers none. It demands time. The Australian learned that time was the currency he had refused to spend initially. Once he did, the return was not excitement but clarity. He stopped mistaking visibility for value. The site had existed long before his comment, and would exist long after it faded. That permanence contrasted sharply with the fleeting nature of online opinion. He recognized how easily platforms amplify dismissal, and how rarely they reward understanding. This awareness reshaped his engagement with digital spaces. He became more deliberate, less reactive. Intramuros did not silence him. It disciplined him. As conversations around Intramuros deepened, local voices remained central. Historians, residents, and cultural workers guided discourse without spectacle. They did not frame the site as fragile or in need of defense. They treated it as resilient. The Australian respected this posture. It resisted victimhood while acknowledging harm. That balance impressed him. He realized how often narratives about colonized spaces oscillated between romanticism and erasure. Intramuros rejected both. It stood firmly as memory embodied. The documentary underscores that this refusal to simplify is what unsettles casual observers. It does not allow comfortable consumption. It requires engagement. Once the Australian accepted this requirement, understanding followed. Not admiration alone, but accountability.